Greetings, everyone. Today, our topic is one of the most famous episodes in samurai history. This was the event when the Mongol invaders were repelled from the Japanese islands by samurai warriors with, of course, the help of the divine winds, the kamikaze. That is a term that many of you are probably familiar with. Perhaps the most well-known legacy of the Mongol invasions is that notion of the kamikaze, something that was recycled by the suicide pilots of the Pacific War. Those individuals appropriated the same imagery and labeled themselves kamikaze, the divine winds, the protectors of Japan against this invading force, which in the context of the Pacific War was, of course, the United States. So our focus today is not so much on that spiritual dimension and the kind of cultural legacy of the Mongol invasions. It's a bit more prosaic. We're going to look at how individual samurai actually navigated this encounter and what the outcome was for the samurai government, for the Kamakura government. As we'll see, the fight against the Mongols was initially a boon for the Kamakura government. They were the ones in charge of organizing this defense against the invaders, and when that was successful, this really helped bolster the bakufu's authority. But in the long run, the invasions ended up being a major source of problems for the Kamakura bakufu. So we'll talk about why in just a little bit. Our thesis for today: the samurai encounter with the Mongols reveals two very different military systems. In Japan, the importance of individual achievements was paramount. Samurai expected reward for any kind of military service. This placed the bakufu in a difficult position in the wake of the invasions and contributed to the downfall of the Kamakura government. So really quite a significant thing that ultimately led to the overthrow of the Kamakura government. Take a moment to let this sink in and think about what question this answers. What are we getting at here? What this argument is really talking about is the impact of the Mongol invasions. What was the effect of them? So a good question for this thesis statement would be something rather broad, such as, how did the Mongol invasion affect the Kamakura bakufu? And the answer is in these different ways. It reveals two very different military systems, so two very different institutional components. The fact that samurai expect reward for anything that they do, and that ultimately places the Kamakura bakufu in a difficult position and leads to their downfall. All of that tied up with what's the effect of this invasion. So that would be our question for this thesis. We last left off, we were talking about the Kamakura government, the first of three warrior governments. Remember that after Yoritomo's death, the Minamoto shogun himself was not very powerful. Actual power rested in the hands of the Hojo regents. Keep in mind that layering of power that happens at really all levels of Japanese government at this time. You've got layers of power in the aristocratic government in Kyoto. You've got layers of power out in Kamakura with the shogun. And so after Yoritomo is gone, early 1200s, it's really the Hojo region who is in control of the bakufu. The Hojo family, chief retainers of the Minamoto. Yoritomo's wife, Masako, was a Hojo. Remember, too, that the court had tried to get rid of the bakufu in 1221, the Jokyu War, but failed. And And after that, it was very clear that it's the samurai government that is superior, and they had taken, kind of eroded the authority that had previously rested in the hands of the aristocratic government, and were steadily kind of chipping away at that and taking more and more of it for themselves. Let's zoom out now to consider what is going on in East Asia as a whole in the 13th century. We've got to back up a little bit in time to talk about the Song dynasty in China. This was a very powerful, very vigorous Chinese dynasty that dominated the continent from 960 to 1127. It is an era of massive economic growth and extensive prosperity in China. The Song dynasty is also an era of innovation. There's tons of inventions that are made here, all kinds of technological achievements. Gunpowder is one, for example. But to give you an idea of how advanced the economy was at this time, how prosperous it was, it is during the Song dynasty that paper money is originally comes into use by the Chinese. And that's the first example of this in world history. Tons of Song coins are flowing all over the place in East Asia. That's what you see depicted over here, or a picture of one rather. This is a Song dynasty coin. And there's tons of these things that show up in Japan. The Japanese government never really able to effectively mint its own currency, and so the coins that are in Japan are almost all Song dynasty coins. Gives you an idea of how influential the Song dynasty is in the region. Where did the Song come from? Now what happened to the Song moving into the early 12th century? The Song is defeated by a group to the north known as the Jin. The Jin are from the steppe up here. They push down into the south and take over a lot of northern China. This forces the Song to move their capital from Bianjing, which is modern Kaifeng, to a southern point, Hangzhou, also known as Lin'an. That's down here. So the capital was up here at Kaifeng, and it is forced to be moved down here to Lin'an. So shift, essentially, from the political center being up here in the north to it being down here in the south, as a result of the Jin invasion. The Mongols are not even in the picture at this time. Despite that, there are tons of horse-riding tribes of Central and Northwestern Asia that are growing in strength. For example, the Xixia. But the Mongols are a really minor group at this time. If you had to guess who would be the most likely group to take over China from the steppe, it would not be the Mongols. They are kind of nobodies. But that does change, and it changes during the lifetime of the Mongols' great ruler, Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan is a fascinating figure. He had an action-packed early life, was the son of a petty chief, was taken prisoner by a rival tribe for a time after his father was killed. But eventually he's able to unite all the Mongol tribes under his banner. He was a terrific strategist and a generous commander, gets a reputation early on in his career as one who shares the spoils of war with his troops, with his followers. Essentially, how does Genghis Khan gain supporters? He buys their loyalty, right? Rewards them handsomely, gets them to follow him. That should sound familiar. But under Genghis, after the Mongols have united, there's tons of different subgroups of the Mongols, but they all come together under Genghis Khan's banner, and they are formidable. They are able to boot the Jin out of North China in the early 13th century, and and the Mongol Empire, there's a series of conquests after that eventually results in this impressive, massive empire that spans all of Eurasia. Really, really significant and fascinating thing that ties the entire continent together under one banner, one political entity for the first time ever, and that has a number of really awesome and interesting effects that we can't focus on here because we want to remain focused on Japan. But this is what the empire looks like around 1260. Everything there in the yellow. After Genghis is gone, eventually one of his descendants, Kubilai, comes to power, and the empire is really at its height during Kubilai's reign. Despite that, it is so huge. Kubilai, by the way, he's the one that finally completes his grandfather's dream of conquering China. The Song dynasty was still hanging on down here in the south of China for many years after the Mongol Empire, and eventually Kublai is able to finally wipe them out, and he establishes a new dynasty in China, the Yuan dynasty, with himself as the Chinese emperor. So despite that great success that he has, the empire is so huge that it has to be split into 4 different kingdoms. These are known as khanates, and this is done in order to maintain stability. Kublai is the top guy, the great Khan, and he controls this area here, which is China, Mongolia proper, and then China. He completed that conquest in 1271. Right around that same time, he's also expanding the empire's borders in the east and launches an invasion of Korea, and then later on in Japan, and those happen in 1274 and 1281. Kublai, by the way, is the subject of a current Netflix show, Marco Polo. Here's Marco Polo here, the Venetian trader who traveled in Asia during the Yuan dynasty, and according to him became personal friends with Kublai. But there's Kublai there, played by Benedict Wong. Now, before we get to the invasions of Japan proper, let's take a look at the Mongol army in particular. Why were they so successful? The Mongols fought as mounted archers. They wore light armor. And remember that they are basically the Central Asian cousins of samurai. That style of fighting originates in Central Asia. Indeed, horse riding itself comes from Central Asia. But this is the way that the Mongols fight. So in a lot of ways, kind of broadly similar to samurai, but there are some key differences that really come to the fore when samurai and Mongols fight. The Mongols are much more cohesive. They fight as a unit much better, in particular in the days since Genghis Khan. Genghis did a lot to kind of revamp Mongol military strategy, and a big focus of his was on coordination, right? Tactics, integrated tactics, working together. We know, for example, that the Mongols used drums, they used signal flags, they used complicated maneuvers like feigned retreats with great success. All of those things require a lot of organization and cooperation, and if you have that in an army, that means that you've got to have a pretty well-defined command structure and troops that actually take orders, for lack of a better term. So when it comes to the Mongols, individualistic combat and displays of bravery are much less important. There's an episode in the invasions of Japan where a young samurai, the two armies are kind of lined up, getting ready to face one another. A young samurai gallops out into the front of his lines and starts reciting his name and his pedigree. You know, I am so-and-so from this house, of that lineage, etc., etc. This is something that samurai, especially samurai who were keen to make a name for themselves would do before encounters. It's all about being seen and heard and noticed as a samurai. And so this young samurai does this before the Mongol army, and the Mongols just thought that was a hoot. They just laughed at him, basically laughed him off the field. So just one example of that contrast. The ritualistic elements of combat were much more important to Japanese samurai. This is evident in their stylized armor, their personalized weaponry, things like this. It's all about standing out, right, if you're a samurai. So you want to have bright colors that make you noticeable. You want to, fly your banner, be visible. Some other more practical differences: the Mongols use different kinds of bows. They use a wider range of weapons, including fire arrows, poison arrows. They had gunpowder weapons, even, probably the first use of them in military history. These are some remains of basically a grenade that the Mongols used. There is a painting of the Mongols here fighting a samurai, and you can see there the exploding grenade up there. That's from the Suenaga scroll that we're going to take a look at next time. Here's a carton of fire arrows, basically a kind of firework with an arrow head on it. All of those innovations, where did the Mongols get gunpowder? From China. It was invented just a century or so before the fall of the Song dynasty. And then, of course, the Mongols take over China, so they had access to all of this key technology. The Mongols also have much larger horses. Horses are native to Central Asia. The steppe is a great place to raise horses. It's terrific habitat for them. And so the Central Asian horse is a larger, stronger animal than what you have in Japan. Now, interestingly, both kinds of warriors, Mongol warriors and samurai warriors, are rewarded similarly. That is to say that they expected to receive some sort of handout from their lords after a successful campaign. The key difference here is that it's a very individual focus when it comes to samurai. In the Mongol case, those rewards are doled out on a more kind of collective basis. Let's say after a city has been successfully taken by the Mongol army, the Khan might share the spoils of that city with his army. And that's not how samurai rewards work, which we'll get into. Samurai, how did they fight on the battlefield at this time? It's really not all that different from what had been going on since the days of the Emishi Wars. Small bands of mounted warriors, so a couple dozen, maybe a few hundred at the largest, and these would be backed up by foot soldier retainers. So you've got a mounted samurai and then his underlings, his attendants. They would skirmish. They would attempt to kill a notable opponent on horseback, practicing yabusame. What does that look like? It's basically like dog fighting with a bow and arrow from horseback. As that's going on, their retainers would assist them by trying to pull the enemy off of their horses, decapitate them if they were thrown to the ground. And they used things like this grappling hook, a kumade, a bear claw to do that. They also used pole arms such as this curved naginata here. But it's quite different from fighting as an organized, cohesive group like the Mongols did. Individual displays of martial prowess are paramount. There's very little overall coordination. In this system, it's all about what you did, you personally, not the kind of group success. That's why it's so important that you stand out. You've got to wear noticeable armor. You want people to be able to recognize you right away. Samurai would customize their arrows, for instance, so that if they shot somebody, they could say that, oh, that is my arrow. I shot that person. You can tell by the way that it's decorated. This is also why headhunting is so important in the samurai tradition. The collection of an enemy head that you see there. Samurai did this not because they were bloodthirsty, fiends, although I'm sure some probably were. Some really enjoyed the kind of bloodlust of war. But on the whole, it's not because of that samurai collected heads. You presented heads to your superior as proof of your achievement. And in particular, if you could collect the head of a really noteworthy person, right, this would add to your achievement and add to your reward. The more heroics you displayed, the more you got. So there's a very practical kind of motivation for this in the case of the samurai. What constitutes prowess or heroics on the battlefield? There's a number of things. Rushing headlong into enemy lines, sort of throwing caution to the wind and just charging forth with no regard for your own safety. That displays this kind of bravery, right, and boldness. That actually happened several times in famous events of samurai history. For example, the Battle of Uji in 1184, when Yoshitsune defeated the Taira. There was a samurai who attacked before the general's command, and he did this because he wanted to be noticed. Being the first to engage an enemy is another way to display your bravery and prowess. Other things, such as if you're the one to find the way across a river or over a mountain. In other words, if you're the one who finds out how to attack the enemy, or maybe you find a secret route that will allow your group to sneak up on them. Being the first to enter an enemy camp, almost like a kind of capture the flag type of thing. Being wounded in battle, that showed that you were out there in it, in the thick of it, and you actually sacrificed yourself. And then, of course, taking heads after battle to prove your victory. Witnesses were extremely important in all of these instances. You had to have somebody see you do this stuff, and they would vouch for you afterwards as part of you collecting your reward. There's an example of this from the Suenaga scroll that we're going to take a look at. One of Suenaga's retainers urges his master to wait for witnesses before he charges into the enemy lines. Suenaga is, he's ready to go, and okay, let's go get him. And his retainer says, no, wait until there's other people here so that they can see us. He says, why would you do something so brave when there was no one around to see it? So samurai bravery, it's a type of bravery. It operates maybe a little differently than this image of some sort of self-sacrificing loyalty to a lord type of consideration. You've got to make a name for yourself. That's how you get ahead. It's a highly individualistic way of fighting. Highly individualistic motivation for fighting. All of those tendencies go against group cohesion, and they can actually damage the overall effectiveness of an army. If you think about it, a samurai army is assembled, you've got all of these little groups, each one is trying to get themselves noticed. That's not necessarily the best way to be effective as a fighting force. It's not really until the 16th century when you start to see a more coordinated style of fighting for the samurai. And it has a lot to do with how upper-level samurai were able to enforce discipline in their armies. So let's take a look at what happens when the Mongols actually do arrive. In 1259, the Koryo dynasty of Korea finally submits to the Mongols after 30 years of war. They held out against the Mongol armies for 30 years, but finally fall to them. What does this mean for Japan? Well, we know that what happens in Korea has a very direct impact on what happens in Japan. The path to Japan is now open for the Mongol armies. And things begin with a series of envoys sent out to the Japanese. Each of them carries this kind of veiled threat. And the Japanese response is basically to kind of stall or ignore. You know, the first emissaries are not overtly hostile, but the underlying threat is kind of there. Eventually, the Mongols do make landfall in Japan in the spring of 1274, and a Minamoto retainer named Kikuchi Takefusa leads the Japanese defenders in northern Kyushu, near Hakata. Right there. So this defense has been organized by the bakufu. The Mongols make an amphibious landing onto the beaches, but they're pushed back to their ships in a counterattack. They then split up into two groups. One group is severely routed. They don't really know the terrain, and they're beaten by a group of samurai. They then regroup together, and there's a big battle the next day. This time it's the Japanese who have to retreat about 10 miles inland to an ancient fortress there at a place called Mizuki. So the Mongol counterattack really effective at pushing the defenders back. The Mongols then sail up and down the coast around Hakata, burn the place to the ground. Just pillage, loot, destroy just about everything. But then that night, they leave. Conlon suggests some reasons for that, but they go home. There does not appear to have been a huge typhoon during this first invasion. But some of the evidence is a bit unclear. So whether or not there was a storm is not known with certainty. But we do know that the Mongols left in this 1274 invasion. A few years later, 1281, Kublai sends another envoy. This time, the Japanese leadership response is to behead that envoy. So that sends a pretty clear message of what they think about, talking to the Mongols, and it basically guarantees that there's going to be a second invasion. The bakufu sets about constructing defensive walls all around Hakata and other sites in northern Kyushu. Here's the remains of one there. Calls up retainers from all over Japan to go out to northern Kyushu and serve as border patrol to man these new fortifications, all at great expense. I mean, this is a huge undertaking, right? Anytime we're talking about building a wall, my goodness, that's expensive. Not just for the construction, but then you have to staff it, right? You've got to send troops out there. In the spring of 1281, the Mongols assemble two fleets. There's a northern fleet consisting of a combined Mongolian and Korean force, and a southern fleet that is made up of Chinese sailors. The northern fleet takes Tsushima, and about a week later they take Iki Island, right off the coast of Kyushu. So here's Tsushima, halfway between Korea and Japan, and then they jump from there to Iki. They are right on the doorstep. So far, so good for the Mongols. They then invade Hakata, same place as last time, but they can't get a foothold because now the fortifications are all built up there. So they have kind of a tough time gaining any ground this time. And after a week of fighting over here at Hakata, they have to return back to Iki Island to regroup. All of that happens before the southern fleet arrives, but the southern fleet finally does arrive about 2 months later, and they land at Takashima, which is about 80 miles west of Hakata. over here on the map. There is skirmishing for a few weeks over there, no decisive battles, and then the huge typhoon hits in the early 8th month. And we know about that typhoon for sure. It definitely happened. The Southern Fleet, though, the one with all of the, basically with the Chinese Navy, is wiped out. And the fate of the Northern Fleet is unknown. Most historians speculate that it too was wiped out by this storm, but it may have just sailed back to the mainland. We're not, we don't know definitively. What we can say, though, is that this storm hit and the Mongols once again left. Now, both the Chinese and Japanese chronicles exaggerate the size of this encounter. The question is by how much? It's complicated by the fact that we know that the Mongols could have assembled armies in the tens of thousands, so they had the capacity to do this, but they probably didn't for these particular invasions, for whatever reason. So, according to the Mongol and Chinese chronicles, in 1274 there's the army of some 90,000, and then 150,000 in 1281. According to the Japanese sources, there was 23,000 to 60,000 in 1274, and 102,000 in 1281. So these are definitely exaggerated. The best estimates that we have are for the Mongol invasion force the first time, probably only around 2,000 to 3,000. And a similar number of samurai in 1274. In 1281, the invasion force was likely larger, probably about 10,000, and probably an equal number, or close to it, of samurai defenders. Now, whatever the case was in terms of the numbers and the size of the forces, the fact is that this was a very significant event for samurai. And we're going to look at the experience of one samurai in particular today, and then also you have your assignment with viewing the scroll. But that individual is Takezaki Suenaga. He was a bakufu retainer from Hojo province, southern Kyushu. So he's from western Japan. He participated in both invasions, 1274 and 81. He's a multiple time veteran of the Mongol Wars. He was wounded in the first invasion and killed a number of enemies, and thus wants to be rewarded. So if you think about that, he's got two things on the list of how to display your prowess, right? He got wounded, and then he also killed enemies. So he should be handsomely rewarded. But he was not. He was not recognized for those achievements, not satisfied with the compensation that he did get, and so after the second invasion, in the late 1280s, he sells his horse, he sells his saddle, in order to pay for a trip to Kamakura so that he can petition the shogun directly for rewards. That's what is depicted here. This is from his scroll. There he is participating in a naval battle against the Mongols. So this is pretty interesting. You think about it. Here's a guy who didn't get what he thought he deserved, and so he, invests heavily in this trip to Kamakura, sells off a prized possession, a horse and his saddle. This is something that's essential for his way of life, his occupation, but sells them off to take the chance that he's going to go to Kamakura, petition the shogun directly, and get what he deserves. And that's what he does. When he arrives, he presents a very detailed account of his exploits, also presents numerous eyewitnesses who can back up his story, and his petition is approved. He is given some rewards. He then commissions a picture scroll, what's known as an emaki, in Japanese. But he commissions this picture scroll to be done in 1293 as a visual retelling of his actions in the battles and his subsequent journey to Kamakura. That scroll has the effect of winning him further renown and also further rewards. So, remember I said that it's all about bragging as a samurai? Well, here's the practical kind of outcome of that, right? But for historians, these are terrific, these scrolls. Probably the best historical source, not just for the Mongol invasions, but for 13th century samurai warfare in general. What's great about them for our purposes as researchers is that they were produced so close to the events that they depict. You know, compared to, say, the Tale of the Heike, right? It's the story of the Genpei War in the 1180s. It's not written down in the form that we know it until probably the 1360s. So that's a huge gap. But here we have something from the 1290s that recalls events of only a couple decades before. Here's Suenaga presenting heads to his superior, heads that he collected. So there he is there. Here's the enemy heads. There is the commander that he's trying to impress, petition for rewards. Here's the commander's underling, his scribe, recording all of this. Now, Suenaga was one of many warriors who sought rewards for their service against the Mongols. But it wasn't just military service. There was a lot of samurai retainers who wanted to be rewarded for their efforts constructing forts and those defensive walls, all of that time spent out on guard duty. You know, they needed to be compensated for this. And that's how the master-retainer relationship of samurai is supposed to work. Samurai lords usually reward their retainers with land or wealth that is taken from a vanquished foe. But the Mongols are a foreign army. There was no territory that was conquered. There's no new lands or spoils to dole out to all these samurai in the wake of the attacks. To make matters worse, the bakufu was not sure that the threat had gone away after the 1280s, after the second invasion. Are the Mongols going to come back? They weren't convinced that that wasn't the case, so the bakufu maintained those border fortifications at great expense for decades afterwards. It ultimately bankrupts the treasury of the Kamakura bakufu, contributes to widespread discontent amongst warriors. There's tons of samurai war veterans here who do not get what they thought they deserved. Suenaga ultimately does. He has to go to great lengths in order to do so, but there's a lot of other samurai who are unsuccessful. And if there's one thing you don't want as a samurai commander, it's unhappy underlings. Right? They cause all kinds of problems. Ultimately, by the early 14th century, the Hojo family, the regents of the Kamakura shogun, are in a very bad position. They've got all of these discontent, unhappy samurai causing problems. They are in financial strain, and the government collapses. A new samurai government replaces them in the early 14th century. And we will talk about those events when we reconvene. Here are your key terms for today.